All right, well, good evening, y'all, and welcome to this edition of History and Highballs, Mecklenburg Resolves. My name is Stacy, and I handle adult education here at the museum. So whenever you join us for one of these History and Highballs programs, you and I get to virtually spend the evening together listening to some incredible stories about North Carolina places and people and what makes our state so special. If you enjoy tonight's program, we invite you to head over to the museum's website at ncmuseumofhistory.org, where you can learn more about upcoming programs, exhibits, and our digital resources. This is also where you can learn more information about joining our North Carolina Museum of History Associates. Our associates and foundation provide crucial funding and support to the museum, which, in addition to many other things, helps make programming like this evening's event possible. We would like to thank those of you who donated funds towards this evening's event. We continue to do our best to keep our programs free to attend, but there are costs associated with keeping our series going. And we just want to thank you so much for your continued support of the museum. A few quick housekeeping items for this evening. We ask that you please keep your mics muted throughout the entirety of the program, and to please type any questions that you have for our guest speakers into the chat function located at the bottom center of your screen. At the end of the program, myself and Becky will be asking our speakers as many of your questions as time allows. So it's my honor to introduce and welcome our guest speakers this evening: Becky McGee-Lankford, Government Records Section Manager, Assistant State Records Administrator for the State Archives of North Carolina; Joshua Hager, Records Analyst for the State Archives of North Carolina; and Joseph Beatty, PhD, Research Supervisor and Historical Research Office in the Historical Research Office for the North Carolina Office of Archives and History. So Joe, I think you're going to lead us off. So I'm going to turn things over to you. Welcome. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Yeah, thanks, Stacy. Greetings, everyone. It's a great pleasure to join you tonight. Many thanks to the Museum of History, my colleagues there, and colleagues at the State Archives who are all joined here tonight to talk about the Mecklenburg Resolves. And of course, many thanks to all of you who've joined us. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about colonial life in the mid-1700s leading up to the drafting of the Resolves in May of 1775. Josh is going to show you some archival sources about the Resolves, and I'll come back briefly to discuss their impact. I think it's important for us to consider the context of these events so that we can understand how they came about. Few things in history arise out of nowhere, and certainly the Mecklenburg Resolves are no exception. These resolves were not the first in the colony. The New Bern Resolves were about 9 months earlier, nor would they be the last, but they were the first to declare really the sentiment of independence. Now, before we get into the resolves, I think it helps to think about the chain of events that led to their meeting. And really, we ought to start with the French and Indian War. For more than a decade prior to the resolves, American colonists had seen, more directly than ever, the power of the Crown and Parliament. In the resolution of the French and Indian War, Britain passed the Proclamation of 1763, ordering all colonists not to settle west of the Appalachians and to respect the boundaries of Indian lands on the colonial frontier. This international war left Great Britain with an enormous debt. And from the perspective of London, this was a prudent policy to avoid future and further conflict. But from the perspective of North Carolina and its neighbors, this stifled opportunities for land and trade and was seen as an intrusion on local affairs. You know, some colonists begrudgingly complied, many others ignored it completely. And for the residents of Charlotte and their neighbors, this action by the Crown was almost literally in their backyard. There was no escaping the impact that the proclamation would have on them. Now, London also needed to pay down the massive debt from the war. To put this in context, British debt doubled to 133 million pounds in 1763. In today's figures, that's probably in the tens of billions. And it cost about half the British budget just to pay the interest on that debt. And so Parliament demanded that colonies help pay that debt and launched a series of actions to raise revenue. I don't want to traumatize you with a replay of high school history, but I think it's helpful. Here's a really brief summary. So remember the Sugar Act of 1764 that lowered taxes on molasses. in hopes of reducing American smuggling, probably a good thing, but it allowed violations of that rule to be tried in British courts without juries. Definitely not a good thing. Colonists saw this as a violation of their basic rights as British citizens. Now, the Stamp Act of 1765 proposed to tax nearly everything made of paper. Newspapers, official documents, playing cards, anything made of paper sold in America, they wanted to put a stamp on it. And colonists reacted swiftly. They opposed the idea of an external tax, a tax coming from London, as they had always set tax policy locally. And so they organized Stamp Act Congress in October of 65 to form a united front against the taxes. It is in this moment that we hear the refrain, "No taxation without representation." Now, Governor Tryon prevented the North Carolina legislature from sending delegates to the Congress, but that didn't stop resistance here. The Sons of Liberty soon grew, counting among its number familiar names like John Ashe, James Moore, Hugh Waddell, Cornelius Harnett. Under their banner, armed groups in New Bern and Wilmington and elsewhere protested, even forcing the stamp agent to resign. And boycotts of British goods up and down the colonies forced the repeal of the Stamp Act in 1766. Now, the following year, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, taxing things like glass, lead, paper, and tea, things that had to be imported into the colonies. Not just that did they pass these taxes, but they also sent British soldiers who soon appeared in ports around the colonies to help enforce these taxes. And it was this military presence that led to the Boston Massacre in March of 1770. The result of this, colonies rallied together. Boycotts and non-importation were successful again, and the revenue on these taxed goods fell sharply. Parliament had to do something, and eventually the taxes on everything but tea were repealed in 1770. Along the way, Parliament made other changes to impose its authority on the colonies, declaring that it would make laws in all cases whatsoever and removing local legislative control over the salaries of governors and other officials, for example. So not only were they making changes to tax policy, but they were also stripping local governments of their control over local and colonial affairs. And colonists braced at these rules that they saw as unwelcome and unwanted changes after decades of relatively little interference from London in daily affairs here in America. Remember that tax on tea? In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, which was intended to save the British East India Company. Colonists had kept up a loose boycott of British tea, and what tea they did drink was most often smuggled in by the Dutch. And because of this, the British East India Company, the largest company in the empire, was teetering on bankruptcy. In today's words, we would say that it was too big to fail. The Tea Act essentially gave the company a monopoly on the American tea market. So tea here would be cheaper than in England. It would even be cheaper than the smuggled Dutch tea. But the colonists I think wisely saw through this, a dangerous precedent in this powerful monopoly. What might be next, they feared. The most memorable outcome of this was the Boston Tea Party. Probably don't need to go into a lot of detail about that, except that in helpful trivia statistics here. In December 1773, a group of Bostonians, led by our friends the Sons of Liberty, pitched 340 chests of tea, that's 92,000 pounds, of British East Indian tea into Boston Harbor. In today's money, that's in the neighborhood of about $1.5 million, if not more. So why does this matter? Because Parliament punished Boston by passing a slate of laws known as the Coercive Acts. The port of Boston was closed. British officials were given immunity from trial in Massachusetts, and instead were supposed to be tried in Britain. The government of Massachusetts was stripped of its local control, town meetings were prohibited, and the governor's council was to be appointed by the crown. Finally, Citizens were required to give room and board to British troops in their own homes if demanded. This explains the unusual Third Amendment in our Bill of Rights about quartering soldiers. Colonists all over soon saw the plight of Boston as their own. What if the British wanted to shut down other ports? What if Wilmington or New Bern was next? The Crown had hoped to isolate Boston from the rest of the colonies by doing this, but it had exactly the opposite effect. North Carolina, in fact, responded by sending the ship Penelope to Boston with more than 2,000 bushels of corn, 22 barrels of flour, and 17 barrels of pork. So colonies quickly sprung into action toward cooperation. This was, I don't want to say unprecedented, but this was a new action toward colonies working together in a really meaningful way. Virginia, in May of '74, called for a meeting, and folks in Massachusetts met several weeks later, proposing that all colonies meet in Philadelphia in September. And that summer, colonial legislatures met to choose their delegates. Now, we've taken a little detour into New England, but let's come back to North Carolina in the summer of 1774, in the weeks leading up to what will become the New Bern Resolves. So Governor Josiah Martin refused to call the legislature together to prevent them from naming delegates to the Continental Congress. Again, we see the colonial government and colonial governors taking direct action against local authority. And this was a new and really dangerous precedent. Now, undeterred, the Speaker of the House, John Harvey, said, well, in that case, the people will hold a convention independent of the governor. And so the people of North Carolina defied the will of Governor Martin and the king's authority and sent representatives to New Bern. This was the first colony-wide meeting in North Carolina that laid out a set of grievances against the crown and called for deliberate and direct intracolonial action. They wanted people to join together. Now, a few counties had met prior and issued their own resolutions, but this was different. I think this is helpful for us to think about. The first thing this convention affirmed in its resolves in New Bern was that they assembled together, in their words, in faithful and true allegiance to the king as their lawful sovereign. And they went on, they said, we will to the utmost of our power maintain and defend the monarchy against the open or private attempts of any person or persons whatsoever. Now, this point is important. The representatives of New Bern didn't want to undo the British Empire. Now, no doubt there were some in the colonies who would have been happy to be done with London entirely, but that wasn't their cause for gathering together. Leaving the empire would have really been hard for people to imagine. No colony at that point had ever separated from its parent. Instead, they grieved that their rights were under threat, and they wished those rights to be properly restored. So in New Bern, they said, we claim no more than the rights of Englishmen, without diminution or abridgment, that it is our indispensable duty and will be our constant endeavor to maintain those rights to the utmost of our power, consistent with the loyalty that we owe our sovereign and sacred regard for the British Constitution. In New Bern, they met not in rebellion, but in hopes of restoration. And if we're listening closely, they're laying out a kind of logic. It says we have rights as Englishmen based on the principles of the British Constitution. Central to that Constitution is the idea that Parliament has the authority to tax people because they're represented. And here they say because North Carolinians can't elect representatives to Parliament, Parliament can't tax them. Within the colony, North Carolina has legislatures modeled after Parliament who are elected and who do have the authority to tax. And if they agree to pay an external tax from Parliament, they're really endorsing that as legitimate, which could lead to more similar actions from Parliament. Now, not just taxes. It's not that these guys were just allergic to paying taxes. They saw other abuses that threatened their rights. So when Parliament suspended the core principles of the Massachusetts colonial charter, rewriting the government of the colony, They moved trials out of the colonies and into Britain. That was a great concern for the colonists here. Delegates said that, at Newbern said that trial by juries of the vicinity is the only lawful inquest that can pass upon the life of a British subject, and that a person ought to face punishment by the legal judgment of his peers or by the laws of the land. And if citizens could not count on the justice of local juries, then there would be opportunity, in their words, opportunity to commit the most atrocious crimes with the greatest impunity. So when they met in Newbern, the recent actions that they reflected on in Boston were not fleeting things. They saw these as a threat to the heart of British law and justice. To make that point clear, they said, "We will consider all persons not complying with this resolve to be enemies of their country." The last thing I want to say is that they spoke not just of words, but of action. The convention there took the next step of announcing their support for the Continental Congress and endorsing the goals of describing with certainty the rights of Americans, repairing the breaches made in those rights and guarding them for the future. But a lot changed between August of 1774 in Newbern and May of 75 in Charlotte. The most important change was the arrival of news in Charlotte of the battles of Lexington and Concord, where American colonists fought against British soldiers who attempted to confiscate gunpowder and supplies that citizens there held to defend themselves. Now, this was a dangerous and frightening turn of events. It was one thing for Parliament to talk about new taxes. It's one thing for them to take political action. It was another thing indeed for them to shoot at colonists. And so within days of this news arriving in Charlotte, the Mecklenburg County Committee of Safety called together the committee to take action. The committee, led by Thomas Polk, met at the Mecklenburg County Courthouse and in the heart of Charlotte today, at the corner of Trade and Tryon Streets, to adopt the Mecklenburg Resolves. This was a radical set of resolutions. It denied the authority of Parliament over the colonies and invested that power instead in the Provincial Congress, which happened to be meeting that week in Newbern. And in the absence of a new government, the resolves set up some basic frameworks. Anyone who received or exercised a commission from the crown was declared an enemy of his country, right? Sounds familiar, and was subject to arrest. And the county's militia were ordered to arm themselves and to maintain vigilance. So what did the resolves resolve? If you'll bear with me, I'll read them through. And there are 20 items, which I think we'll see make a lot of sense in context. So in Charlottetown, Mecklenburg County, May 31st. This day, the committee met and passed the following resolves. Whereas by an address presented to His Majesty by both houses of Parliament in February last, the American colonies are declared to be in a state of actual rebellion. We conceive that all laws and commissions confirmed by or derived from the authority of the King or Parliament are annulled and vacated, and the former civil constitution of these colonies, for the present, wholly suspended. To provide in some degree for the exigencies of the county in the present alarming period, we deem it proper and necessary to pass the following resolves. So here they have said very clearly, we invalidate the rule of the King and of Parliament. And having dissolved the government by this act, we need to set up something in the meantime. So item 1, that all commissions, civil and military, herefore granted by the Crown, to be exercised in these colonies are null and void, and the constitution of each particular colony wholly suspended. So government officials and government acts are done. Number 2, that the provincial Congress of each province, under the direction of the Great Continental Congress, is invested with all legislative and executive powers within their respective provinces, and that no other legislative or executive does or can exist at this time in any colony, in any of these colonies. So they're taking that power and investing it in the Continental Congress, saying, this is now our legitimate ruling body. Number 3, as all former laws are now suspended in this province, and the Congress have not yet provided others, we judge it necessary for the better preservation of good order to form certain rules and regulations for the internal government of this county until laws shall be provided to us by the Congress. So, hey guys, we've done something bold here. We need to set up a framework for government. Number 4, that the inhabitants of this county do meet on a certain day appointed by this committee, and having formed themselves into 9 companies, to wit, 8 for the county and 1 for the town of Charlotte, do choose a colonel and other military officers who shall hold and exercise their several powers by virtue of this choice and independent of Great Britain and former constitution of this province. So knowing what had happened in Lexington and Concord, they saw the need to set up their own system of defense and mobilize their own new militia under their own authority. Number 5, that for the better preservation of the peace and administration of justice, each of these companies do choose from their own body 2 discrete freeholders who shall be empowered each by himself and singly to decide and determine all matters of controversy arising within the said company under the sum of 20 shillings, and jointly and together all controversies under the sum of 40 shillings, yet so as their decisions may admit of appeals to the convention of the selectmen of the whole county, and so that any of these who shall have power to examine and to commit confinement persons accused of petty larceny. That's a lot of 18th century language to say that they're essentially selecting justices of the peace to help resolve small claims, and that those individuals have the power to jail people if necessary. Number 6, that those 2 selectmen thus chosen do jointly and together choose from the body of their particular company 2 persons properly qualified to serve as constables who may assist them in the execution of their office. Again, we're seeing setting up a government, a system of authority and rule enforcement. Number 7, that upon the complaint of any person to either of these selectmen, he do issue his warrant directed to the constable, commanding him to bring the aggressor before him or answer him or them to answer the said complaint. So they're granting warrant power, essentially, serving someone with a warrant and potentially placing demands on someone to appear in front of these men in action as a court almost. 8, that these 18 selectmen thus appointed do meet every 3rd Tuesday in January, April, July, and October at the courthouse in Charlotte to hear and determine all matters of controversy for sums exceeding 40 shillings, also appeals, and in cases of felony, to commit the person or persons convicted thereof to close confinement until the provincial Congress shall provide and establish laws and modes of proceeding in all such cases. So here we're setting up basically a district, a circuit court almost, where this panel of judges are given the authority to decide more important cases or to hear appeals. Number 9, that these 18 selectmen thus convened do choose a clerk to record the transactions of the said convention, and that the said clerk, upon application of any persons aggrieved, do issue his warrant to one of the constables to summon and warn the said offender to appear before the convention at their next sitting to answer for the aforesaid complaint. Again, we have more 18th century legal language about establishing and running the court system. Number 10, that any person making complaint upon oath of the clerk or any member of the convention that he has reason to suspect that any person or persons indebted to him in a sum above 40 shillings do intend clandestinely to withdraw from the county without paying such debt, the clerk or such member shall issue his warrant to the constable, commanding him to take the said person or persons into safe custody until the next sitting of the convention. So they are giving arrest powers to prevent people from running out of town without paying their debts. Number 11, when a debtor for a sum below 40 shillings shall abscond and leave the county, the warrant granted as aforesaid shall extend to any goods or chattels of the said debtor as may be found, and such goods or chattels to be seized and held in the custody by the constable for the space of 30 days, in which term, if the debtor fails to return and discharge the debt, the constable shall return the warrant to one of the selectmen of the company where the goods and chattels are found, who shall issue orders to the constable to sell such a part of the goods as shall amount to the sum due, and that when the debt exceeds 40 shillings, the return shall be made to the convention, who shall issue orders for the sale. So they're confiscating property to pay for debts. Number 12, that all receivers and collectors of quitrents, public and county taxes do pay the same into the hands of the chairman of the committee, to be by them dispersed as the public exigencies may require, and that such receivers and collectors proceed no farther in their office until they be approved of by and have given to this committee good and sufficient security for a faithful return of such monies when collected. This is about taxation, right? This is that the tax collectors that they're authorizing people to collect taxes as needed and to spend those funds as required, and that those tax collectors must be approved and they have to give security for this matter of public trust. 13, that the committee be accountable to the county for the application of all monies received from such public officers. So again, here we're getting into the matter of taxes and of financial responsibility. That all these officers hold their, numbers 14, sorry, that all these officers hold their commissions during the pleasure of their respective constituents. Essentially, it's not exactly describing an election, but that people serve at the pleasure of the people, that these officers serve at the pleasure of the people. Number 15, that this commission will sustain all damages that may ever hereafter accrue to all or any of these officers thus appointed, and thus acting on account of their obedience and conformity to these resolves. So they're emphasizing the responsibility of these officers in carrying out their duties. Number 16, that whatever person shall hereafter receive a commission from the Crown or attempt to exercise any such commission heretofore received shall be deemed an enemy to his country. And upon information being made to the captain of the company where he resides, the said captain shall cause him to be apprehended and conveyed before the two selectmen of the said company, who, upon proof of the fact, shall commit him, the said offender, into safe custody until the next setting of the convention, who shall deal with him as prudence may direct. So again, anyone acting in the service of the Crown is now an enemy to the people of Mecklenburg County. 17, that any person refusing to yield obedience to the above resolves shall be deemed equally criminal and liable to the same punishments as the offenders above last mentioned. So they're declaring this as the law of the land, that anyone who refuses these rules is himself subject to the same punishments. 18, that these resolves be in full force and virtue until instructions from the General Congress of this province, regulating the jurisprudence of this province, shall provide otherwise, or the legislative body of Great Britain resign its unjust and arbitrary pretensions with respect to America. So that we're going to continue this. We're going to continue this set of rules and actions until we get word from the General Congress of North Carolina that tells us how best we should proceed into the future. they give the opportunity for perhaps a little bit of an olive branch toward Great Britain, where they say, if Great Britain should resign its unjust and arbitrary pretensions. But I think we've gotten far enough along here that I don't think they expect that to happen. 19, that the several militia companies in this county do provide themselves with proper arms and accoutrements and hold themselves in readiness to execute the commands and directions of the provincial Congress and of this committee. So now they're organizing their militia to be ready. Given the experience of their fellow colonists at Lexington, I think they saw this as a real threat and saw the prudence in that. And finally, number 20, to put action behind that order. Number 20, that this company do appoint Colonel Thomas Polk and Dr. Joseph Kennedy to purchase 300 pounds of powder, 600 pounds of lead, and 1,000 flints, and deposit the same in some safe place hereafter to be appointed by the committee. Signed by order of the committee, Ephraim Brevard, clerk of the committee. So I hope, and that's the full text of the resolves. It's pretty short, but when we think about it in its fullness, not only have they declared the government of Great Britain to be void and invalid here in their county, but they had the forethought to see that in the absence of a government, they needed to put something else in place. And so they laid out the framework for a government. I think this is a powerful act. I mean, it's, this is really the first call for independence, and they were savvy enough to understand that a land without government could lead to anarchy. And so they had to set up and chose to describe, I think, in great detail what was necessary to run a legitimate government in their county. You need people who are in charge of local precincts. You need to have a militia to provide for defense. You need to have a court system to resolve disagreements, both petty matters and then, what we consider to be sort of superior court matters, and to also set up an appeals court. They could have very easily, one could imagine a group of people declaring their independence from Great Britain and not taking care to outline what was going to be there to replace it. But instead, they outlined all of this in pretty specific detail. And I hope we see that the experience of the other colonies and the experience that came out of the provincial Congress that drafted the Newbern Resolves really helped them see what was necessary and what was important. I think the language about anyone in defiance of these to be an enemy of their country is powerful stuff. They were obviously concerned about taxes. They were obviously concerned about judicial affairs. They were obviously concerned about safety. So it wasn't just this bold declaration, which it was. It wasn't just a bold declaration. It was also putting in place something that would follow and that would hold the county together until direction came from the provincial Congress that would lay out some direction for North Carolina as a whole. Now, these resolves were published in full in the North Carolina Gazette of June 16th, 1775, and received wide circulation. As I think you would expect they would, somebody opens the newspaper and sees this this declaration of autonomy, and word spread quickly. Royal Governor Josiah Martin wrote on June 30th after reading this that the resolves, in his words, surpass all the horrid and treasonable publications that the inflammatory spirits of this continent have yet produced. Some pretty bold words. Richard Cogdell wrote that the resolves exceed all other committees or the Congress itself. And Samuel Johnston on June 27th wrote that Tom Polk too is raising a very pretty spirit in the backcountry and that he has gone a little farther than I would have chose to have gone, but perhaps no farther than necessary. So even to men of their time, to political leaders of the moment, they saw how powerful and important a statement that the Committee of Safety in Charlotte made on this date. So I probably rambled on a little too long, and I appreciate your patience in my not so dramatic reading of the text of the resolves. I should probably hand it over to Josh so we can see some examples from the archives of what we have.
Thanks, Joe. And let me go ahead and get this going. All righty. So since I am from the archives, I will be showing what we have. Now, the spoiler alert for this is I would love to be able to show you the original Mecklenburg Resolves. We don't have them. The Mecklenburg Resolves did not survive. There was reportedly a house fire in 1800 that destroyed the original Resolves. So we don't have them in the archives, unfortunately. What Joe is reading from the Gazette, that's the record that survives. But there are plenty of primary sources from that time period that help us to understand what was happening around the Resolves. The first thing I want to point out is that maps are incredibly useful, because in the tale that Joe was telling us of the news coming from New England and then the news going to delegates being sent to New Bern and back, we need to think about geography for a second, and we need to think about it in pre-20th century terms. North Carolina is a long state. If you drive even today from Manu to Murphy on Route 64, you're going to know just how long, on Highway 64, you're going to know just how long this state is. If you look on this map, on the far left, you can see Mecklenburg County. It actually was carved out of Anson County in 1762 on the furthest west portion of what's shown on this map. And Mecklenburg is going to be carved up later and later. But it's essentially based on this map. And this map was drawn originally in 1779. This is as far west as you're going to go, but notice of the counties we think of today, a lot of them aren't there. You have Cumberland County, and then you go straight to Anson, straight to Mecklenburg. There's no Scotland, there's no Richmond, there's no Hoke, there's no Lee, there's no any of that. But look how far Mecklenburg County is for New Bern, and we know that intellectually speaking today, right? But think about in this time period, when we say the news traveled fast, we say the news traveled fast for 1774 and 1775. So just keep that in mind. Historic maps are always useful to think about just the breadth of the area we're dealing with. And there we have Mecklenburg County right here. And then we have some other sites. We have New Bern here on the purple dot on the far right. We have Hillsborough in the top, which of course is where you have the most of the regular conflicts that have occurred a few years earlier, culminating in the Battle of Alamance in 1771. And then you have the boundary line of South Carolina. Mecklenburg County, as you see in Charlottetown, to this day, this is true. It's much closer to South Carolina line than it is to New Bern. Despite the loss of the records, the existence of the Resolves has been proved by the contemporaneous published copy from the South Carolina Gazette. Mecklenburg's proximity to South Carolina explains why it was published in South Carolina. We know that Joe said it was in North Carolina as well eventually, but it was published here first. What makes these Resolves so special is what Joe said. They annulled all the laws and commissions confirmed by or derived from the authority of king or parliament. So it basically installed martial law in the county. But this is not in isolation. We know what Joe was saying earlier of where it came from in New England. But we have a lot of records documenting this progress in several record groups in the State Archives, primarily the Secretary of State papers, the General Assembly records, and the colonial governor's papers. And we'll be getting some examples from those throughout the rest of this presentation. So first I want to take you to Rowan County. This is the Rowan County Resolves of August 8, 1774. The resolves, as you see on the screen, agreed that we will at all times, whenever we are called upon for that purpose, maintain and defend at the expense of our lives and fortune His Majesty's right and title to the crown of Great Britain and his dominions in America, to whose royal person and government we profess all due obedience and fidelity. This comes to us from the Secretary of State record group. The local committees of safety is part of that record group. These profess solidarity with Boston, the resolves, and they actually are professing that because of the intolerable acts that we had heard about just a minute ago. The resolves sought to hold colonial officials accountable and to assert the right of the colonial assemblies to self-govern, especially with regard to taxation. But they, as you can see here, still very much say that the colonies belong to the crown and to Great Britain. Reform is the name of the day, not independence. And we heard from Joe that that is pretty common. This is before, of course, Lexington and Concord. The Parliament had said things, had done things with acts and taxation, but they had not yet fired on colonists, Boston Massacre notwithstanding, in a few years earlier. So we have a lot, actually more records from these committees of safety. Committees of safety proliferated in North Carolina after the First Continental Congress. They were formed at the county or municipal level because of the Congress to enforce the boycott of British goods precipitated by the Intolerable Acts. So this is in the wake of the Boston Tea Party in 1774. So we actually have several committees of safety records in the state archives in the Secretary of State record group. What you see here is the first page of the proceedings of the Wilmington New Hanover Committee from November the 23rd, 1774. So this is about 2 months after the First Continental Congress convened on September the 5th, 1774, and then it adjourned in late October. The committee very straightforwardly says here in the very first page, if you can see at the top, you see the word Philadelphia, that it had been created to execute the resolves of the late Congress held at Philadelphia. Two and a half months later, this advertisement originates in Perquimans County. It called for delegates to the various committees to attend a statewide provincial convention in New Bern on April 3rd, 1775. So this was published in February 11th, 1775. This is from the North Carolina Gazette, which we have a copy on microfilm in the State Archives of North Carolina. It's one of our stronger collections that we have newspapers from this time period. We have newspapers from the 19th century as well. We had a project in the 90s where we microfilmed papers, particularly those that are going defunct. So we have a lot of older papers that are no longer in print on microfilm in the state archives. The state library also has a large collection in our same building. So obviously this is getting the attention of Governor Martin. We heard already what his response was to the Mecklenburg Resolves, but this is before that. Governor Josiah Martin's proclamation in March 1st, 1775 responded directly to the advertisement that he saw. In it, he specifically mentions the resolves, and he says, and I quote, "I do hereby earnestly exhort the many good people of this province that they do not subject themselves to the restraints of tyrannical and arbitrary committees, which have already in many instances proceeded to the extravagance of forcing his Majesty's subjects, contrary to their consciences, to submit to their unreasonable seditions and chimerical resolves, doing thereby the most cruel and unparalleled violence to their liberties under the pretense of relieving them from imaginary grievances." You can hear the disdain in his voice, and not just from my exaggerated performance either. Martin had a very, shall I say, spiked tongue when it comes to his pen. He did not hold back. So his exaggerations we get later are par for the course for Mr. Martin, who, by the way, was the longest tenured resident of Tryon Palace, ironically enough. But we have this proclamation here. He's basically saying it's all lies. These are all things that don't actually not actually occurring. We can help you. Don't listen to those folks over there behind the curtain. But of course, we know that they indeed did. But the governor wasn't going to stop there. He then made an address to the House of Assembly, House of Commons on April the 3rd, decrying the shadow government meeting in Philadelphia and assembling in North Carolina right under the noses of the official House. So this is before he stops the legislature. He is saying, gentlemen, this is not right. This whole thing is a farce. Ignore it. It is not legitimate. But the Assembly responded of their own. On the last page of a published response to Martin's speech, the Assembly printed its resolve, passed April 7th, 1775. It said that the House did highly approve of the proceedings of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, and that they are determined as members of the community in general that they will strictly adhere to the said resolutions and will use what influence they have to induce the same observance by every individual in the colony. After the resolution was passed, Governor Martin dissolved the House of Assembly, as we heard Joe tell us, and less than 2 weeks later, we have Lexington and Concord on April 19th, 1775. We have two documents here that we hope to give a couple of alternative perspectives on the events we've described so far. On the left, we have a letter dated May 3rd, 1775, in the Governor Josiah Martin papers. It's from the Earl of Dartmouth, who was Secretary of State for all of the colonies. He praises Martin's progress in securing allegiance to the crown and expresses faith that the allegiance of respectable persons will sway the rest of the colonists and help quell the rebellion. By the time Martin writes to Dartmouth on June 30th, 1775, to report on various circumstances that have occurred, and that was a direct quote, Martin has removed himself to Fort Johnston and relays that several weeks after the Assembly was dissolved, on May 23rd, 1775, members of the committee, whom Martin describes as a motley mob, which is a great band name, by the way, confronted Martin at Tryon Palace about the removal of the cannon from outside the governor's house. Martin admits that although he gave another excuse to the colonists, his true purpose was to keep munitions from falling into the provincial revolutionary network's hands. Even though we don't have outright war yet, we certainly see the machinations of both sides concerned with things as typical for war as making sure the other side doesn't get cannon. That letter is from the governor's papers. On the right, we have from a private collection 424. We have around the same time Richard Caswell, who would become the first governor of the state of North Carolina. He was in Philadelphia at the Second Continental Congress, which convened on May 10th, 1775. Caswell wrote to his son on May 11th, 1775, describing his trip from Halifax to Philadelphia, the independent county militias who protected the delegates on their journey, and the losses of the Bostonians had suffered in the early battles of the war. Caswell asks his son to show his letter to friends and uncles in a bid to raise companies. Though he hopes these older relatives will not engage yet in any company themselves, to his son he writes, "But you, my dear boy, must become a soldier and risk your life in support of those invaluable blessings, which once lost posterity will never be able to regain." Two of Caswell's sons went on to fight in and survive the Revolutionary War. It was in this atmosphere of these two letters that the Mecklenburg Committee of Safety met, reportedly on May 19th and 20th, 1775, and then drafted the resolves on May 31st. Other local committees drafted resolves at around the same time, providing original examples of such documents that we can show that weren't lost to fire. Here's an example from the Wilmington, New Hanover Committee of Safety from 1775. On June 19th through 20th, a week after the Mecklenburg Resolves, the several committees of the District of Wilmington met, and this included folks from Cumberland, Bladen, Brunswick, Duplin, and New Hanover counties. and their resolves were called the Liberty Point Resolves. These are focused on the military action in Massachusetts and responding to the proclamation Martin had issued from Fort Johnston on June 19th. They accused colonial officials in Parliament of trying to enslave the people of the colonies, but they never actually named the King George III himself as a perpetrator or annul his authority the way the Mecklenburg Resolves do. So even though it's a week later, it's not nearly as radical. Later in August 1775, Surrey and Tryon counties released similar resolves in the run-up to North Carolina's first provincial convention. Yes, I did say Tryon County. If you're an aficionado of the all 100 counties, you'll know Tryon County no longer exists. What was Tryon County mostly becomes modern-day Lincoln County. Here are several pages of the Surrey County resolves dated April 25th, 1775. Here, the revolutionaries were very much focused on the power of the provincial government and only provincial governments to levy taxes. However, they still claimed loyalty to the king, casting the royal governors and parliament as the villains, but the king blameless. So here we have the seal on there, liberty or death, and God save the king. A bit of an oddity when we're used to seeing liberty or death as the purely revolutionary catchphrase, when in reality, in this case, both messages are joined together at the hip. We have here a list of the folks who are meeting at the convention. And then we actually have the start of the resolves and the conclusion of those resolves. So that's just an interesting mix there of revolutionary fervor mixed with actually support of the crown. In April 1775, the provincial convention started, and this is an image of the first page of their journal, which is in the Secretary of State Record Group. They met starting in Newbern. The journal actually starts in August 24, 1774, but we have this page is from 1775. Instant is a snippet of the page where Mecklenburg's delegate Benjamin Patton is listed. Because there are no records from the Mecklenburg group and the printed copy lists only the clerk, we can't know for certain whether Patton was part of the committee that created the Mecklenburg Resolves. But it's likely that he was, based on the names that are listed for Mecklenburg for subsequent conventions, including Thomas Polk, who is named in the Resolves, and John McNitt Alexander, whose recollection from the 1800s forms the basis of what we now know about what happened with the Mecklenburg delegation. This is the back page of the transaction of the Mecklenburg delegation from May 20th, 1775. It's actually held at UNC in the Mecklenburg Declaration Papers collection. It was given to General William Davie by John McNitt Alexander, who claimed to have been at the meetings in the Committee of Safety in May 1775. Next to it is a snippet of text attributed to Mecklenburg's revolutionaries, printed in the Charlotte Journal in December 1827, a moment when Mecklenburg's role in the Declaration or the Revolution was being written into history. Alexander's descendant, Joseph McNitt Alexander, collected material related to the Mecklenburg Resolves to submit his family's role in Mecklenburg history and Mecklenburg County's status as a hotbed of revolution, i.e. the hornet's nest. He sought to prove the existence not just of the Resolves, but also of the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. The Mecklenburg Declaration is, we think, apocryphal, probably an exaggerated memory of the Resolves. Joe can fill us in more on that if you have questions about it. But we certainly want to focus on the Resolves as we know and have confirmation that they did indeed happen. We've pulled out here an important quotation from the transaction of the Mecklenburg delegation. And to quote here, it may be worthy of notice here to observe that the foregoing statement, though fundamentally correct, yet may not literally correspond with the original records of the transactions of said court of inquiry, as all those records and papers were burnt with the House on April 6, 1800. But previous to that time of 1800, a full copy of said records, at the request of Dr. Hugh Williamson, then of New York, but formerly a representative in Congress from this state, was forwarded to him, Colonel Thomas Polk, in order that those early transactions might fill their proper place in a history of this state. This is an important quote to remember from what we know about the creation of the Mecklenburg Resolves, but it does come from many years later, long after victory, at a time when folks were trying to cement their legacy as being part of the revolution in the 1820s. So that's all the records that we have to show you today. If you have any research queries about those records or would like to use them for your own research, I encourage you to contact the archives reference staff at archives@ncdcr.gov. We are open to the public Tuesday through Friday from 9 till 5 and on Saturdays from 9 till 1. We also can handle remote reference queries if you're not in the Raleigh area. I do want to give credit to our former Records Description Unit Supervisor, Kelly Policelli, who wrote this presentation originally, and to thank her for putting that work together. And again, I am Josh Hager, and you can reach me at the email listed there on the screen. And Stacy, with that, I hand it back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Josh. And thank you so much, Joe, as well. We have a couple of questions, very intense questions. So I think Becky and I are going to take turns asking them to y'all. So the first one says, there are claims, and I think both of you touched on this, there are claims that the Mecklenburg Resolves are apocryphal. It was originally suggested that the Mecklenburg Resolves influenced the writing of the Declaration of Independence, but both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson insisted that this was false and that there had been no such document. What all evidence do we have that attests to the authenticity of the Mecklenburg Resolves?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the short answer to that is that there's, as Josh pointed out, and as we saw from the almost immediately contemporaneous accounts of the resolves in print in the news, I mean, within weeks, I don't think there's any question about the Mecklenburg Resolves. The Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence is the apocryphal document that these two get twisted up together, and so yeah, the short answer is that the resolves are good. I think we have excellent documentation about them. The declaration is the more problematic source.
I agree wholeheartedly.
Okay, I'll ask the next question. The Battle of Alamance has often been called the first battle of the American Revolution, but many of the former regulators later became loyalists since the quarrel had been with Governor Tryon, not the king or parliament. What are your thoughts on this popular perception of Alamance?
Joe, I can start with this one, if that's
Yeah,
okay.
go ahead.
I actually just installed an exhibit case in our search room on the regulators, and that covers the Battle of Alamance and the map from Gautier that was commissioned by Governor Tryon and his confidence that he would win the Battle of Alamance, which of course he did. And I also have done research on the Battle of Alamance connected to our ongoing program on documenting the world of Outlander. If you're familiar with the show Outlander, they portrayed the Battle of Alamance on the show, with some inaccuracies that the Alamance Battleground folks will be happy to tell you about. But by and large, they did help advise it. I think the perception that it's the first battle of the Revolution is frankly a bit too simple, because the regulation, I've always thought of the regulation, and I continue to think of it as North Carolina's own little war. And it is insulated from the events of the Revolution. And I say that because the sides you have in the regulation have very little correspondence to what happens in the Revolution. You said there are people on the regulator side who become Tories. So too are there people on the militia side who become patriots. So I don't think the lineage is going to be a one-to-one split. There are parallels for sure, because there are folks in what is known as the Western Frontier area. Hillsborough is the Western Frontier of North Carolina, if you can believe it, who are thinking that we need to have government reform in the eastern part of the colony, that the representatives aren't really doing what's best for them. But there's also in the regulation connected to religiosity and a religious movement in that area of the colony. There are other grievances that are harder to define, and in some cases, the grievances differed from person to person. In some ways, it was, if it would have happened today, it would have been a hashtag movement on Twitter, if I think of the regulation, and it ballooned. In fact, at the Battle of Alamance, a lot of the folks on the militia side, or not on the militia side, on the regulator side, when they saw that Tryon's troops were actually approaching, decided to yell insults at them and run away. They didn't want to actually fight. They just wanted their point to be heard. I'm not saying people didn't die at the Battle of Alamance. They did, but a lot of folks hightailed it out of there. So it's an important event. It's huge for North Carolina history, but I don't think it's a revolutionary battle. Joe, I'll let you take it from here.
No, here. I mean, I think, yes, what Josh said. The thing I would add is that I think what we're seeing, and if there is a connection with the revolution, I think you're seeing folks on the frontier who feel themselves abused by government in some ways. And like Josh said, there are different ways that people feel like they're being abused by the government. For the regulators, it had an awful lot to do with taxation. But what Josh said about religiosity, I think matters. It would take us another history and highballs discussion to talk about the Church of England and establishment of the church, and how for Scots-Irish people living, Scots-Irish Presbyterians living out in the backcountry, this was a real problem. But I think those kinds of things played into it. So I think the real connection, the way I see, in addition to what Josh said, I think the connection that I see with the revolution is folks taking action and joining together in like demonstrable political action against the abuses of government. And I think that does inform what happens later, although, people pick different sides from what we think they might have originally, and people's concerns certainly over the next 10 years start to change also.
That would be a really interesting follow-up, History and Highballs, just as a side note. Okay, our next question is, or statement question, is, it has been argued that when North Carolina seceded from the Union on May 20th, 1861, the convention delegates purposefully chose the anniversary of the Mecklenburg Resolves as the date for the succession vote because they felt that they were repeating the example of their revolutionary forefathers. Are there any primary testimonies to support this claim?
The honest answer to this is I would have to do a little more digging to give you a definitive answer. I will say kind of the received wisdom is that, yes, that was a deliberate action. The convention was meeting in May, so it was, I guess, somewhat convenient that they were meeting then, had to pick a date. And if you're meeting in May and declaring their independence, I pulled up a copy of the secession ordinance, and I think there's some language here that's helpful. So the ordinance adopted, this is from the 1861 secession ordinance, that the ordinance adopted by the state of North Carolina in the convention of 1789, whereby the Constitution of the United States was ratified and adopted, and also all acts and parts of the General Assembly ratifying and adopting amendments to the Constitution are hereby repealed, rescinded, and abrogated. This is not the exact same language as the Mecklenburg Resolves, but it's the same spirit. And they go on later to say that the state of North Carolina is in full possession and exercise of all the rights of sovereignty which belong and appertain to a free and independent state. So I feel like they're invoking the same spirit. So I'm not sure. Josh may have some wisdom about the depth of the records that stand behind this, but I think, yeah, they probably did.
If there is intent is one of the most difficult things to find in official records. It's not usually a thing that's documented in official channels. There might be private papers from some of the authors of the secession order that would say if they had it, but it may have also been something that was just a plan that they made and not recorded anywhere, and it kind of becomes down as apocrypha. I will say one of the one of the things that makes it different is we talk about first and freedom with the Mecklenburg Resolves and other resolves around North Carolina. And there's debates about if they're actually first, but it's certainly early, right? The Mecklenburg Resolves are very early. The North Carolina secession order compared to the rest of the Confederacy is late. North Carolina did not want to secede for a long, long time, and they were sort of backed into a corner because all the states around them had done it. So I would say that it may, even if it invokes the same spirit, it's very much a different context for, you know, being radical versus having to catch up to everybody around you. Did you agree with that, Joe?
I was muted. Yeah, I think you're right.
I'll take this last question. Why are there X marks across some of the Surrey County resolves? I've actually looked at the Surrey County resolves recently because I actually had them pulled for a tour for a group of students to look at. To me, it gives me the impression that they were writing it in real time. So they were taking notes as the session was going on. And I suspect what happened after that was a clean copy was written. The official copy was written. And what we have is the journal notes. Whatever happened to the original, it may have been sent to somebody, it may have been posted in a public forum. But what we have is the journal of the clerk, so or the scribe for the session. So that's my best estimate of just looking at it and seeing what's going on with it.
I agree with Becky. I haven't worked with the Surrey Resolves as much, but ironically enough, my area of expertise in our records is 20th century records. And I use a lot of the 20th century General Assembly session records quite often. And you'll even see in the bills we have, the original bills, people have marked out things on the bill with an X, and they'll write in amendments, and then the final copy ends up in the Secretary of State papers because the bills are sent to the Secretary of State. But the actual draft bills from the General Assembly will have those edits sometimes all the way up through the 20th centuries and back to the colonial era too. So that's my guess as well. If it was an X at the bottom, then it could have been a signature of some kind. But honestly, surprisingly, it wasn't always an X to mark the spot without a signature. Occasionally, people would write some sort of doodle that they would indicate as their signature, and they would try to have their own doodle that was unique to them to be as close to a signature as possible. But in this case, I agree with Becky. It's literally a draft in real time. It's like the well, what is it? The inline comments in Microsoft Word, track notes. That's what we've got here. So.
Well, and not to get too,
that's the way I would describe it. Yeah.
And not to get too far off on a tangent, but those documents are really fun to read because you can see in real time what people are thinking and how they're responding to things. Yeah, sometimes it's just, you know, grammatical stuff, but sometimes they're digging into things. That's fun to read.
Oh, some of the best texts I've ever read in letters and other things are the strike-throughs. Those are always so fascinating. Don't just discard something if you're doing historical research because there's a strike-through. You're going to find a gem there because why it was stricken through is just as interesting as why it was written in the first place.
All right, well, I think those are all of our questions from our audience members. So I just would love to thank all of you so much for your time this evening and for this special look at behind the scenes of the Mecklenburg Resolves. It was just really incredible, and we're just so appreciative that you took the time to share these stories and these documents with us. So thank you all so much.
Thank you for having
us. Yes.
Yeah. Thanks, Stacey.
And thank all of you who joined us this evening. We hope that you enjoyed it, and we hope to see you at our next History and Highballs, which is our rescheduled Somerset Place, happening on Thursday, May 12th at 7 p.m. via Zoom. In the meantime, we hope that all of you have a wonderful evening, and we will see you soon. Take care, everybody. Have a great night.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.